Muito obrigada, Dr. Mauro. Vou chamar agora o Dr. Shao, que vai falar sobre Preenchendo Lacunas na Dieta, a Promoção da Saúde, uma revisão do papel dos suplementos dietéticos. O Dr. Shao é responsável pela área de política global de alimentação e nutrição da Herbalife, possui uma vasta experiência em pesquisa de nutrição humana, política nacional e assuntos regulatórios, incluindo o Council for Responsible Nutrition. É autor e coautor de mais de 40 artigos científicos revisados. Atua como presidente do Conselho Científico da Aliança Internacional de Associações de Suplementos Dietéticos, IADSA, e possui PhD em Bioquímica Nutricional, mestrado em Ciência da Nutrição Humana e é bacharel em Biologia pela Universidade de Brandeis. Dr. Shao, por favor.
Here, it's forward.
And that's the laser. Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. It's really my pleasure to be here. I haven't been back to Brazil, I think in maybe 3 years, maybe 2-3 years, the first time. So I really appreciate the opportunity. I want to thank the organizers, ILSI Brazil, for inviting me to come speak to you today about this topic, which is filling nutrient gaps and health promotion with dietary supplements, food supplements. I think a lot of what I'm going to speak about today has been already touched on by a few other speakers. So some of this may seem a little bit repetitive or maybe reinforce some of what you've already heard. And then I think some of the speakers who will follow me will take some of the high-level information that I provide and go into a little bit more detail in their respective areas. So here's a brief outline, what I intend to present. So a little bit on non-communicable disease trends, state of affairs in Brazil. I think the previous presentation was an excellent overview of that from a nutritional standpoint. Examples of supplements filling nutrient gaps, some examples of studies showing health promotion and disease risk reduction. And then I'll end with some closing thoughts. Something that we've observed really around the world, this is a global issue, transitioning in developed countries. Developing countries are still transitioning, but it's really moving from looking at dealing with diseases of communicable disease to non-communicable disease over time. And this is something that probably started around the turn of the 20th century, and you can see that developing countries are just crossing over, but many developed countries have gone way past this, and the really public health challenges are in non-communicable disease, not communicable disease. And as I will show, of course, many of you know, these non-communicable diseases are traced back to diet and lifestyle, because, of course, our gene pool has not changed in the span of 50 years or 100 years, but our lifestyles have changed. We've shifted from having to deal with diseases of overt nutrient deficiency to diseases of excess. So this is how the lifestyle has changed and really impacted also mortality. So here is data from the WHO looking at the non-communicable disease death rate per 100,000 during this period of time. And you can see here in Brazil and Latin America, it's about 400 to 500 per 100,000. This parallels the obesity epidemic, which was referenced in the previous presentation. In some parts of the world, the overweight or obesity prevalence is a staggering 60%, or even greater than 60% in some cases, like in the US, for example. There are signs that in some countries this incidence or prevalence of obesity is plateauing, particularly among young children. There is signs, data in the U.S. suggesting that in young children, obesity is plateauing. But among adults, in developing countries, developed countries, either one, the obesity rate continues to rise. As I mentioned, diet and lifestyle are major contributors to death, mortality, and here is Latin America is indicated by the red color here, and looking at the deaths attributable to risk factors, diet and lifestyle, high blood pressure, smoking, and diet, all in the top contributors to overall death. Now here in Brazil, according to the data also from the WHO, 74% of deaths are caused by or attributable to non-communicable disease. And we can see here that over the course of time, there has been a slight increase in the number of deaths attributable to non-communicable disease, both males and females under 70 years of age. So, as already mentioned in the previous presentation, the overweight population is rising here in Brazil, 42.6% in 2006, 53.8% in 2016. So it's a steady and significant continual rise, probably projected out across the wall here, would continue to rise if we don't intervene. So, a summary on overall global non-communicable disease. 40 million of the 56 million deaths in 2015 were due to non-communicable disease. That's a very high percentage. 48% of deaths in low and middle income countries in 2015 occurred before the age of 70, and 80% of premature of deaths were caused by premature heart disease, stroke, and diabetes. And of course, these are lifestyle, primarily lifestyle and diet-related issues that can be prevented. So what's some of the reason? Well, from a nutritional standpoint, I think as you also heard from the previous presentation, diets are very energy dense, have become very energy dense, energy rich, but nutrient poor. So we have this situation, a dichotomy of being overfed but undernourished. That's where you have the simultaneous, the hidden hunger of obesity but nutrient inadequacy at the same time. So this is just some data showing that here we have Latin America, that from 1980 to 2010, there's been a steady rise in the mean energy intake of the population. Now, here in Brazil, as we know now, less than half the population consumes the recommended levels of fish, fruits, and vegetables. That's already shown in this this figure, plus the previous presentation made reference to this as well. And we have low compliance of recommendations of lifestyle and diet, lifestyle-related patterns. So we have eating habits, physical activity, alcohol consumption, tobacco use. So for physical activity, for example, in the free time, only 22.5% of the population is exercising in their free time. So here in Brazil, there's a failure to adhere to basic lifestyle recommendations. And as we also saw, nutrient inadequacy, sometimes woeful inadequacy, where depending on the nutrient, almost 99% of the population fails to achieve the recommended intake for vitamin E. For vitamin D, you heard as well, very high prevalence of inadequacy, almost 100% inadequacy. That's just a few examples. Calcium, we also heard about men and women, 80 to 90% of the population failing to achieve recommended intakes. Now, I wasn't able to find data from here in Brazil. Perhaps there's a publication that I missed. I wasn't able to find it. But we do have data in the U.S. And some of you may be familiar with the NHANES survey. It's very familiar to the survey that was just referenced in the previous study, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And what it found, of course, similar to in Brazil, in the U.S., through diet alone, majority of the population fails to achieve recommended intakes for a number of key micronutrients. However, when looking at supplement users, the prevalence, and this is the percent of the population below the estimated average requirement, drops significantly for, in this case, these key nutrients: folate, vitamin C, vitamin A, vitamin D, and vitamin E. Supplement users, the prevalence of inadequacy drops tremendously among supplement users. So this is data, survey data from the U.S. in this case, that suggests that using dietary supplements can fill these nutrient gaps left by inadequate diet. But as I said, I was not able to find similar data in Brazil. Perhaps it exists. I would assume that you would see a similar finding. So now I'll go through some examples of some specific micronutrients. Of course, vitamin D, we all know. We heard from the previous presentation about the level of inadequacy here in Brazil. This is just a slide that shows briefly vitamin D metabolism, which I won't go through. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. You might be less familiar with the suggested range for what is considered optimal vitamin D status. Of course, 25-hydroxy D3 is the accepted biomarker of vitamin D status. And whether you look at it in nanogram per milliliters or nanomole per liter, these are just different units. You can see that adequacy is considered in this range, 20 to 30 nanogram per ml, 50 to 75 nanomole per liter. Above that would be considered optimal. Below that is considered insufficient or even deficient, in the case of vitamin D. So some of the consequences of inadequacy, of course, most of the data related to vitamin D's impact on health is on bone density, bone mineral density, fracture risk, and of course there's particular diseases, deficiency diseases of osteomalacia and rickets, and chronic disease of osteoporosis related to vitamin D inadequacy. But you're all familiar, more recently there's been data to show that serum 25-hydroxy D levels are inversely related with a variety of non-bone related outcomes, such as cancer, immune function, cardiovascular disease, asthma, even cognitive decline. And it's also inversely related to fat mass. So obese individuals tend to have lower vitamin D status. I was able to identify this publication looking at vitamin D status among postmenopausal women in South America. Here in Brazil, you can see that within these studies, relatively small sample sizes, but looking at the serum 25-hydroxy D levels, in this case below 24% below the 20 nanogram per liter cutoff, and here even in the summer, a large percent below 30 nanogram per liter. So clearly, the data suggests here in Brazil that not only is the intake below recommended levels, but the actual status. So I think in the world of nutrition, we would always prefer to base recommendations, intake recommendations based on status and not just intake. I think we could spend a whole afternoon debating the shortcomings of dietary intake surveys, the accuracy of intake surveys. So really, nutritional status is the best way to assess need and to assess whether populations are sufficient or not. So that's another reason why we look at the 25-hydroxy-D levels. Now, correlating in the case of bone density, what would be considered an optimal serum 25-hydroxy-D level is shown from this study from Heike Bischoff-Ferrari and her colleagues, where approaching around 100, in this case, this is nanomole per liter. To get nanogram per ml, you divide by 2.5, okay? So this is about 100 nanomole per liter is where you have kind of that peak bone mass achieved in older adults, peak bone density. Now, another publication by the same group here, Heike Bischoff-Ferrari, also looked at the dose response for supplemental vitamin D, and showing that, in fact, as more is taken in orally, 25-hydroxy-D levels do increase in a dose-responsive manner. So these levels can be achieved with this range of vitamin D international units. And of course, as you know, vitamin D is difficult to obtain in the diet. It's not in very high levels. That helps to explain why inadequacy is so high. There's also concerns about the effects of sun exposure on skin. And so supplementing is perhaps one of the best, safest ways of achieving optimal 25-hydroxy-D levels. I don't have it here, but I will tell you that I was co-author on this paper that was actually a risk-benefit analysis of vitamin D. One thing that we looked at was, what are the serum 25-hydroxy-D levels that are associated with toxicity? And toxicity meaning hypercalcemia. Hypercalcemia does not occur in the normal population until the 25-hydroxy-D levels exceed about 225, 250 nanomole per liter. So these levels here, these doses that you see here, and the serum levels achieved for 25-hydroxy-D are quite safe, at least as far as hypercalcemia is concerned. Important point about safety. Here's a recent meta-analysis that was conducted looking at 34 prospective cohort studies. And what they found was, for every 10 nanogram per ml increase in serum 25-hydroxy-D level, there was a reduction in the relative risk, in this case of cardiovascular events, total CVD events, CVD mortality, a relative risk of 0.9 or relative risk of 0.88. Not huge effect size, but if you consider over the course of for an entire population, can be quite impactful. And this is an analysis from a U.S. study that was conducted a couple of years ago, looking at the impact of calcium and vitamin D supplementation on healthcare cost savings, specifically as it relates to bone fractures and osteoporosis. And the analysis looked at a period over the course of about 8 years, estimated the total cost of osteoporosis-related fractures, and then based on a fairly significant relative risk reduction, estimated what the cost savings would be by avoiding those fractures through calcium and vitamin D supplementation, and then subtracted the cost of the supplements themselves. And that's where what you see is the net avoided costs over this period of time. They estimated 1.87 billion US dollars over an 8-year period, accounting, of course, for the cost of the supplements themselves. So that's fairly substantial healthcare cost savings as a result of reduction of risk of osteoporosis from calcium and vitamin D supplementation. Moving on now, I think from what I've shown in the previous presentation, the intake of certain antioxidants in Brazil is quite low, vitamin E in particular. Vitamin C as well is also quite low, and vitamin A as well is quite low. The percent intake below recommended intakes is quite high in the population. This is a recent study that was published showing inverse association between dietary intake of vitamin C, serum levels of vitamin C, and stroke risk. So 11 prospective cohort studies looking at intake, vitamin C intake, showed a relative risk of 0.81. And then combining six studies looking at serum vitamin C, a relative risk of 0.62 for the risk of stroke. This is a Cochrane systematic review that was published a few years ago as well, a meta-analysis looking at supplementation of vitamin C and the duration of colds, not necessarily prevention of colds, very important distinction between prevention of common cold and the duration of the common cold, and found that looking at adults combining 17 trials, an 8% reduction, and in children, depending on different doses, 200 milligrams versus 1 to 2 grams a day, also significant reductions in the duration, in the case of adults, about a day less, children a day and a quarter or a day and 2/3, depending on the dose. Here's data that show what the optimal serum vitamin C level could be. Plasma levels appear to reach a peak between this level, around 200, between 100 and 500 milligrams. So around 200 milligrams per day consumption leads to the peak or the plateau, excuse me, of serum vitamin C. So around 200 milligrams. This is a study, is a meta-analysis just published last year, looking at 18 prospective cohort studies looking at antioxidant intake and pancreatic cancer risk. So this is antioxidants and cancer risk. The risk was inversely associated with higher dietary intakes of selenium, vitamin C, vitamin E, beta-carotene, beta-cryptozanthin. All of these odd ratios were significant. This is comparing the highest intake to the lowest intake for those antioxidants. So what I've shown is just a series of examples here related to a few micronutrients, essential micronutrients of showing benefit. Transitioning now to omega-3s, which I think you'll hear a little bit more about from another speaker that follows me. These are essential, some essential, some non-essential, at least not yet essential. Fatty acids that have important effects and a range of functions in the body. They have been shown to, in the case of the long-chain omega-3s, like eicosapentaenoic acid, docosapentaenoic acid, have been shown to reduce serum triglycerides, reduce the risk of heart arrhythmias, reduce blood pressure, and also thrombosis. I was able to find some data from published from here in Brazil looking at omega-3 status in Brazilian pregnant women. These are red blood cell membrane levels of the omega-3s, and the TR here stands for trace, which is virtually non-detectable levels. So in the case of pregnant Brazilian women, we have a challenge here of having very low omega-3 status according to red blood cell levels. Although I didn't actually look for it, it would suggest to me that also breast milk levels are probably also correspondingly very, very low, which suggests perhaps in the case of breastfeeding, children may not be getting the omega-3s from the mom that they should be. Alternatively, if it is high in breast milk, it comes at the consequence to the mom, whose own status ends up being quite low. This was a study published in Japan. The reason why I put this study up here, this was an interesting study because those of you who know, in Japan, fish intakes are quite high. Omega-3 status is quite high. And yet, in this group of patients, they were hypercholesterolemic, so they had high cholesterol levels, high triglyceride levels, and they also had correspondingly high background omega-3 intakes. But when they consumed 1,800 milligrams of omega-3s per day over a 5-year period, you can see there was a substantial reduction. This is taking EPA in the cumulative incidence of coronary events in this population, which is very, very interesting, where they already had a very high baseline intake of omega-3s. If you consider a Western population, either the US or Brazil, where fish intake is comparatively low, omega-3 status is low, the potential impact of supplementation could be potentially much higher. Apologize for this. This is very difficult to see because it's so small, but I did want to cover it because I believe here, 2017. So a number of systematic reviews and meta-analyses have been published looking at omega-3s. This is the most recent one, I believe. There's so many of them now, it's almost hard to keep track, but this is the most recent one. Each of these represents looking at a different, slightly different population or a different outcome. So in A, it's any CHD event in randomized trials among all subjects. B is among subjects with a baseline triglyceride level of more than 150 milligram per deciliter. C is among subjects with baseline LDL cholesterol greater than 130. And then D is any coronary heart disease event in prospective cohort studies. So it's a real mix. It's a mix of looking at prospective cohort studies, randomized trials, and looking at different cutoffs of triglyceride and LDL cholesterol. And you do see favoring omega-3 intake as far as a benefit is concerned in all of these cases. So now to cost savings again. Now, the U.S. study I showed for calcium and vitamin D, they also looked at omega-3, but I wanted to provide a more recent analysis that was conducted by Europe, looking at the cost savings from supplementing with omega-3s, long-chain omega-3s, EPA, DHA, the net cost savings annually. And these numbers are in hundreds of millions of euros per year. And you can see greater than 700 million euros in countries like France, Germany, Poland. You have 460 to 580 million euros in Spain. So you can see, again, significant cost savings using a similar model again, looking at what's the expected incidence of heart disease over the course of, in this case, a 5-year period, the impact of omega-3 supplementation, and then the cost savings minus the cost of the supplements provides the net cost savings annually. Finally, finishing on a couple of specific studies, very, very high-profile, well-known studies that were done with vitamin and mineral supplementation. Some of you may be familiar with this. This was published quite some time ago, back in 2001. It's the first of two major studies looking at age-related macular degeneration that was funded by the National Institutes of Health in the United States. AREDS is the acronym, Age-Related Eye Disease Study. This was a randomized trial, nearly 5,000 subjects, 55 to 80 years, with a 7-year follow-up. And they were given a daily supplement, which you see here. This is the composition, the formula of the supplement, and they were followed over 7 years. And what they found was that for the advancement, so the progression of AMD was reduced significantly by this regimen of supplementation, which you see the curve here. And looking also at visual acuity loss over the same period of time, you also see a significant effect of the combination of micronutrients that was included. Now, that study was followed up with a second study called the AREDS 2, and I'm only showing you a little bit of data from that study. The second study incorporated the use of the carotenoid lutein and its cousin, zeaxanthin, also over a 5-year period. And what they found was a 26% reduction in AMD progression in patients in the lowest quintile of lutein intake. So this was a situation where across the whole population, the impact, the effect was quite small, but when they examined the folks who were in the lowest quintile of intake at baseline, they benefited the most from the supplementation and experienced a 26% reduction in AMD progression, macular degeneration progression. This is another famous study, the Physicians' Health Study 2, done at Harvard University, where physician men, 14,600 men over the age of 50, were supplemented with a multivitamin every day and followed for about 14 years, and found a slight but significant, statistically significant effect, a reduction, 8% reduction in cancer risk, total cancer, as primary prevention. And in secondary prevention, actually an even greater risk was reduction was observed of 27%. So this is just a simple daily multivitamin, which we know from U.S. data will reduce nutrient gaps left by the diet, so gaps in nutrient intake. In this case, also reducing the risk of cancer over a long period of time. Again, this was in a group of physicians, male physicians in the United States. Are we doing on time? Quite well. Okay. Yep. Finishing up. So, what do some authoritative bodies think about supplementation? So this is the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics in the United States. Their position on nutrient supplementation: among the groups most vulnerable to inadequacy of one or more nutrients should consider supplementation: older adults, pregnant women, people who are food insecure, alcohol dependent, strict vegetarians and vegans that don't eat meat. Is that on it, right? Those with increased needs due to a health condition, and so on and so forth. That's quite a large group of individuals, but it goes on to say those restricting energy for energy intake for weight loss or control, those not consuming an adequate amount of food to meet energy requirements as a result of poor appetite or illness, those eliminating one or more food groups from their diet on a regular basis, or those consuming a diet low in nutrient-rich foods despite adequate or excessive intakes. Didn't we just talk about that? The diet being energy-rich but nutrient-poor. My question is, isn't this everybody? Is there anyone that this is not covering, this slide and that slide? I think it covers us all. Suggests to me that we would all benefit from using a dietary supplement on a regular basis. So now I will wrap up here with my closing thoughts that as we've heard already, and probably hear more throughout the day, non-communicable disease rates continue to rise globally, and also here in Brazil, obesity as well. We've seen Brazilians are not achieving diet and lifestyle recommendations, in some cases falling woefully short for certain nutrients. Dietary and food supplements can play a useful role in filling nutrient gaps left by a suboptimal diet, and studies suggest that nutrient supplementation can also promote health, and there are studies suggesting that their use is associated with the reduction in healthcare costs. So, I thank you for your time. I look forward to the panel discussion.